on this episode of Suspect Zero, the case of Luc Gregoire.
As one of the most beautiful campuses in all of Canada, Champlain College of Lennoxville is home to the Cougars, where the blue and gray are proud to represent a campus that wears its beauty like a surreal piece of art. The college is located in a scenic rural setting, with beautiful buildings that represent the vision it once had and the strength in its growing population. The allure of the surrounding area draws in many students from various walks of life and welcomes the community it serves, which is why it is incomprehensible that anyone would want to tarnish this beautiful canvas and destroy the reputation that was built on the values, traditions, and culture handed down by previous generations. But it would be tarnished, not once, but over and over again, when girls were showing up in the surrounding areas strangled with questions unanswered. One of these victims, a young, beautiful, headstrong student who had chosen to return to college to finish her degree, 19-year-old Teresa Allore, disappeared on November 3rd, 1978. 5 months later, on April 13th, 1979, her body was discovered in a small body of water, approximately 1 kilometer from her dormitory residence. Upon her disappearance, police initially suggested she was a runaway. When her body was discovered, police then suggested that she was the possible victim of a drug overdose at a college party. This seemed to be the better and more acceptable explanation directed at a fearful community. Since 2002, Teresa's brother, John Allore, whose podcast, Who Killed Teresa, has continued the investigation, identifying 14 other unsolved murders from 1975 to 1981, which he believes may be connected. Beginning in 2018, John Allore started to focus on other Quebec cases from the 1970s through the present era, cases that further suggest systemic failures in how investigations are carried out. His book, Wish You Were Here, was written with the help of a longtime friend about the unsolved murder of his sister Teresa. Its heavy and rich descriptions surrounding the death of his sister illustrate the love a brother will never abandon and the undying quest he has to see justice served. In today's episode, Michael and I are excited to welcome John Allore, the beautiful Teresa Allore's brother, who hasn't stopped fighting for his sister. Welcome to Suspect Zero, where we not only discuss unsolved cold cases, but serial killers whose crimes are lesser known or virtually unknown, yet the most terrifying. I'm Dawn Washburn, and joining me is my co-host, Dr. Michael Arntfield. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Don. And of course, we have a guest this week, as you mentioned, John Allore, author of, I'll just give our viewers a quick glance here, Wish You Were Here, Murdered Girl, A Brother's Quest, and The Hunt for a Serial Killer. So we're going to be talking about the contents of that book and who that serial killer is today. And I'd like to welcome John Allore, all the way from North Carolina, John?
Correct, North Carolina. Thanks, Dawn, and thanks, Michael.
No problem.
So maybe I'll just jump in here. John, you and I met a few years ago when you looked me up as a guest for your podcast, Who Killed Teresa. And that sort of then morphed into this book that represents, years of just extraordinary research and a deep dive not only into your sister's case, but into other connected cases, seemingly connected cases, compellingly and presumptively connected cases in not only Quebec, but then across the country in Calgary. So we've talked about this before, these in the US interstate and in Canada interprovincial nomadic serial killers who, and it's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, seem to be able to effortlessly outwit police and defeat systems like the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program or the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System that are supposed to track mobile killers. And just they keep getting away with it until usually they get scooped for some minor, unrelated crime, and then maybe they get identified through DNA, but sometimes not. So, John, maybe can you just give us a little bit more background on? Obviously, you've always been interested in your sister's case and carried the fire for her for years, but how this then dovetailed into this larger investigation into probably Canada's most prolific suspect zero, or one of them.
Yeah, with any of these, I'm kind of unique in the sense that I am the victim's brother, and there are several like that, but I kind of take a different approach to it. I'm probably a little more analytical than some that I've seen. I'm probably a little less advocating for some new law, victim law, or I'm not, or trying to get my NGO status. Those things don't really interest me a lot. But by nature, I mean, my profession, my métier is finance and budgeting and forecasting, financial forecasting for 20 years. So that kind of data analysis, whether you're translating that into predictive behavior or into geospatial maps, just sort of comes natural to me. And some things don't. I'm not saying I'm rotten at interviews. I really, I'm not very talented at that, getting somebody in a room and picking them for information, but I'm pretty good at data analysis and forging through old documents and finding old documents and kind of saying, well, what is this in relation to this and that kind of thing. And it just fascinates me. It began, as I said, as a ground zero with my sister's case and just a what if, very naturally. Well, was there anyone else who disappeared or wound up murder in that very small place in the eastern townships of Quebec at the same time? Yes, two others, Manon Dubé, Louise Cameron. Okay, when? Within a 17-month period. Fine. Were they solved? No, they were not solved. That's interesting. What were the circumstances of their death? Oh, they were very similar. And then just growing from that. Okay, what else has not been solved? Well, 20 or 30 cases in the area, and you begin to expand into the Montreal area. Not surprising, Montreal would have a lot of unsolved murders, but slowly what began, and I think a lot of people misinterpret my work. Dawn is quite right in the introduction when she says the possibility of 14 murders being connected, but I'm not one of these guys looking for a universal theory, or I don't want to tie, everyone to my suspect zero necessarily. But the common link that I did find, and I continue to find, is criminal investigative failures at the hands of law enforcement. That's the link between the 14 and then the 20 and then the 30. And that's, in a nutshell, that's what continues to drive me. And focus on my work. It's like an itch. And, I just ended a 9-part podcast on one particular murder from 1969. And I'm thinking of, okay, what's next? Where do we go next? And you take a breather, but I just always find myself endlessly curious with these things.
Now, as somebody who works in analytics and budgets and works with numbers and sort of, again, operates within a standardized framework and according to adequacy standards, what, from your viewpoint, and we talk about this a lot at the Murder Accountability Project, and we are actually just featured on Dateline NBC because now people are paying attention to, we've identified sort of what the common pitfalls are regardless of police department, and identifying a certain standardized common characteristics among failed investigations. You can then figure out how to improve on that. But from your viewpoint, as someone who does this for a living, in terms of, again, quality assurance, let's look at the Canadian cases that you examined. What was the common denominator in how all these cases failed so quickly?
I think to begin with, I do want to address the Murder Accountability Project, because that was sort of my window into your work. I couldn't believe that murderdata.org existed when I think I discovered it 5 or 6 years ago. Looking at the FBI crime data from across the country. That's the kind of work that I excited me. And very quickly, myself and a colleague took the StatsCam crime data and tried to replicate murder data. Of course, there's limitations because you don't have the part B or part 2. That's the nugget. That's the real gold. There's more descriptive information in that in there. But we were able to create, like in Tableau, some maps of 50 years of murder data in Canada. And what we saw very clearly, if you mapped it, was in the early 70s, Quebec had a very low murder resolution rate, the lowest in the country, from about 1973 to 1980. And this seemed odd because actually murders were falling. So if murders were falling, you'd say, well, they have more capacity to solve crime. And yet they were at, 65 to 75% efficacy, where the rest of the country was around 85. And then slowly through you saw a blip, you saw an outlier, obviously with the biker wars in the early 90s in Montreal, but basically unsolved murders began to shift in Canada to the west. And you see the Picton effect and the effect of basically women disappearing on strolls in Calgary, in Manitoba, in BC, and Quebec kind of leveling off. But some of the common denominators with investigative failures that I saw were a lot of things that you brought up in Murder City, which when I read, and I'm not trying to plug, this is not a let's plug each other's book. It's really from the heart that when I read that book about what was going on in London, Ontario, I was like, my God, this is the mirror image of what was going on at the same time in Quebec. Flat, with very clever offenders practicing territorial confusion. You murder in one police jurisdiction and you dump in another police jurisdiction, and causing absolute chaos. That was certainly something I saw. The copycat effect, sort of like, well, if he's getting away with it, I can get away with it. That was certainly going on in the Eastern Townships. The book documents Luc Gregoire, who is our suspect zero, but also Robert LaPlante, who was a serial rapist in the area at the time, and several others who were sort of like learning from each other almost, and learning and testing what they could get away with. So, many, and the destruction of evidence, physical evidence, was another common denominator.
Yeah, you talk about copycatting and mimicry, and it sounds, it's not as though these guys meet, at some weekly symposium and say, okay, this is what we're going to do, or what'd you do last time? But they are keenly aware of each other's existence. These demi-mones of sexual predators, especially child sex offenders, are pretty more tight-knit than you would think, and they all, in that day and age, knew each other if you operated locally, because of course there would be dead letter drops and there would be places to go and buy pornography, and everybody knew everybody in those communities. So they're keenly aware of each other. And I call it the Boston Stranglers, plural effect. So Albert DeSalvo was convicted for the final, and just recently, comparatively, confirmed through DNA to be responsible for the final murder in that series. But it's widely hypothesized that there are multiple stranglers who, once the first one or two crimes went unsolved, began mimicking the MO and acting out of their own set of disordered motivations, perhaps even targeting specific people and just lumping it in with the Boston Strangler. So, Albert DeSalvo, history has decided, was the Boston Strangler. He's probably one of 4 or 5 stranglers, plural. And it just happens that as these crimes began to ebb, and he's the only one who got arrested, that he basically takes the crown for all of them. So that is a very real phenomenon, as you again articulated and wish you were here. So maybe we can talk a bit now about your suspect zero, who I am completely convinced that, I mean, you've built a circumstantial case against Luc Gregoire that is, I mean, were he alive, I mean, you could probably, meet the evidentiary bar, certainly in a wrongful death civil suit, I would think, which is a diminished evidentiary bar of on the balance of probabilities versus beyond a reasonable doubt, which is obviously a much higher bar in criminal cases. But I mean, you have really built out a case whereby it's so compelling, and yet no one is talking about him. He remains a suspect zero. And you basically linked two sets of unsolved murders of women that for years people talked about: the Montreal serial killer, the Eastern Township serial killer, and the Calgary serial killer. And people speculate one may have existed. You're saying not only did one exist in both areas, but it's the same person. So, Don, I don't know if, I mean, you just read the book. I read it some time ago. Did you want, what were your thoughts before maybe John gets into how he stumbled across this guy? What stuck out to you about Gregoire?
And we did this with the Chicago Strangler case too, where, we were looking at certain things and connections. And it really just, and even with the Jeanette Tapama case we did, this reminds me of that a little bit, where, you hear all these facts, and I can't believe people can't tie it together. I just feel like we need to sprinkle like we do for mosquitoes, like logic somewhere, because people are not connecting things. And I'm a novice at this. And to me, it really was like an eye opener. And I was angry reading, because you know how I am about the victims. I can't get the victims out of my head. And I always place myself in the position of the victim, like, how afraid they must have been, how they walk into the woods with these people, and they know, just the feeling. And because I always say, people look at the narrative, but they don't really take in what's truly, truly happening. And that's the side I always look at, is the side of the victim and the families as well, because like we always say, they're all victims. Everyone becomes a victim. But the anger that it built in me, that again, those checks and balances, you can close the case, and the case can be closed, but that doesn't mean it's solved. And I think that's, it's easy to write these things off and say, it's not your family. It's easy to write them off and say, oh, it was a drug, or it was this, it was that. But why not take the time? If I was an investigator, I would do everything in my power to make sure I had the right person, or to make sure I had the right facts. So when I was reading this, I just kept thinking about Teresa. Like, why are you not giving her what she needs to get this case closed? I'm not like, listen, it's speculative at this point, but everything's based on speculation, isn't it? I mean, you weren't there. So, I mean, if we can come close to making sure that the right person gets due diligence in this, then why not? And another thing that struck me, John, was the college, the reaction of the college, and the one person who kept putting it back on Teresa, that she was some kind of, she was some kind of drug addict, when her friends clearly said, we have made a pact not even to do these kind of drugs. At best, we smoked weed, and it just, the fact they weren't adding up. And so when someone comes in and starts looking at it, why didn't they look at it like that? I don't understand. So I'm more angry because I'm all about the victim, and so I think the things in this particular book just made me look at it like, wow, you can close the case, but it really hasn't been solved. You're okay with that? You can go to bed at night knowing that case wasn't solved. And I know the audience is gonna completely ask these questions. When you look at when you look at the page of Teresa, and just to open that one picture, how could you not fight for what you're seeing with her face down in the water? I can't get that picture out of my head. It would just make me it would just drive me to do things, like, I'll go out on a limb. I do crazy things. But this is something I would really be really involved in. So the book made me, I hope people read it, because you get a different perspective of the entire thing from a family member's perspective, another victim, not necessarily the victim, but definitely another victim and one suffering, so.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what got me.
You mentioned closed and solved, and I talk about this distinction a lot in my next book, How to Solve a Cold Case. But John, this is, I would suggest, much like a couple of other cases that we've talked about on this show, I mean, we'll never know for certain. There will never be a day in court because Gregoire is now dead. But there's a difference between a case that is resolved or cleared, and we talked about what clearance rates and what clearing a case means a few weeks ago. But a case can be unresolved or uncleared for statistical purposes, and yet at the same time, history can deem it solved. So I sort of, do you know what I mean, John?
I completely know what you mean. And like for me, there's a number of cases associated with Gregoire which will never have their day in court, but I consider them solved.
Exactly.
And there's a number of other offenders who on paper are one-offs in Quebec jails. Claude LaRouche, Guy Croteau, who are in jail and considered dangerous offenders, curiously, for one murder. But I consider some other cases associated with them solved. In terms of you know what Don said, a couple of things we can get to, and I will get to, why, in particular in Quebec, people aren't interested in Luc Gregoire. We'll get there, and then in terms of the victim, all I'll say there is, I'm not interested in painting a portrait of my sister as some kind of saint or anyone. What people say and the story they stick to, can be one thing, but what really happened is another thing. So it may be true that somehow Teresa was involved in some, I don't know, I got caught up in some criminal element or something like that. But all I would say is, show me the proof. I'm not so sure of my ideas that I would never be open to some other possibility. But you got to show me something that makes reasonable sense. And until that happens, I'm going to say that I am like 90% sure that the offender is Luc Gregoire, but 10% open to some other possibility if it should ever arrive.
Luc Gregoire, a 33-year-old roofer, on the surface was a kind, outgoing person. He dropped out of Sherbrooke High School and was thrown out of his home at 15 because he was accused of sexually assaulting a relative. He had also made his way to the Alberta prison system for armed robbery. In the book, Wish You Were Here, the authors outline a very shady person who couldn't stay out of trouble. He was described as being a disheveled type of character who smelled unpleasantly, mostly of cigarettes. His landlord recalls the backseat of his car being covered with glass and blood, which really set off red flags. He had a very creepy aura that didn't make anyone feel completely comfortable when he was around. It was as if he was hiding and pushing down the monster inside him. This would explain his being triggered by small events where his being a hothead would be seen by others. Unbeknownst to many people, Gregoire had a library of victims who had their legs broken, were raped, tortured, and thrown in a field where their families couldn't find them. Luc Gregoire died in prison in 2015 after being convicted of only one murder, the 1993 sex slaying of Calgary convenience store worker Leilani Silva. Questions still circulate about Teresa Allore also being one of his victims, and probably many more that police can't connect due to lack of evidence.
So this would be a good point to jump off into a discussion of who Gregoire was. So I know it's tough to distill, 330 pages worth of research and writing into an elevator speech on who he was, but he is the suspect zero that I'm pretty sure no one other than those who have read your book have ever heard of, and they should have. So for our viewers and listeners, who was he?
I'm up to the task. In about 2002, Patricia Pearson and I worked on a series of articles for the National Post newspaper in Canada, profiling these three murders, including my sister's. And in that profile, we were really profiling an anonymous serial killer who we thought was out there, and coming up with a profile of this individual. And when it was all over, we took what we had written to a Canadian criminologist and basically said, do you have anyone in mind? And they said, yeah, you should look at Luc Gregoire. So that's really the starting off point in about 2002.
And who was that, Eric Beauregard?
I can't say who it was.
Okay. I saw him in the acknowledgements, and I mean, he is an encyclopedic knowledge of offenders currently serving time, because I know of no other criminologist who has conducted one-on-one interviews with dangerous offenders, incarcerated dangerous offenders, more than he has. So yeah, I mean, I just threw that out there. If there's a guy who knows everybody in the system, it's him.
And I would say, I agree with you. So Gregoire was started as a petty criminal in Sherbrooke, Quebec. He grew up in downtown Sherbrooke. He was very athletic. He was very charming. I mean, if you look at newspaper accounts from the time, he was star athlete on the baseball team and the hockey team. And there's notices of him, being very prolific as an athlete, who slowly became a small town criminal. Now, we know from his early life, between the ages of 16 and say 20, growing up in Sherbrooke, he had access to a lot of vehicles. He was a day laborer, a roofer in the area. And he started to get into trouble that we know of through his record in the early 1980s. With a series of, like, a robbery of a gas station, the rape of a woman in a parking garage in 1980, 1981, which started to create a high profile for him. And what's interesting at that time in early 80s is with the rape in particular, he's a little sloppy initially in his methods. He says too much, and he tells his victims, I've done this 5 times before. I've raped 5 times before. But you kind of get the feeling that what he's really saying is, I've done a lot more before, but he's rather proud of the rapes. So he's willing to admit to those. All of this activity is happening within walking distance in downtown Sherbrooke. He lives within walking distance of the parking garage, within walking distance of the gas station he robbed, which is in walking distance to the bus station, which is in walking distance of his parole office in downtown Sherbrooke, the parking garage between the parole office and the apartment he's living in, which is interesting because later he becomes definitely a troller, a guy in a car riding around, and which is exactly what he's doing by the time in 1993 he's arrested. But a little before that, he joins the Canadian military almost immediately when he's 16 or 17. He does his basic training in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, where another victim named Bizinet was found strangled on the outskirts in 1977, which is close to Chambly, where another victim in 77, like 6 weeks earlier, Helen Manast, was also found strangled. So strangled. We know definitely that Louise Cameron was strangled, possibly with a military bootlace. We know that Cameron worked at the local armory or militia that Gregoire was later associated with, the Sherbrooke Hussars, the Fusiliers in Sherbrooke, when he later finished his basic training. He spends sometime in 79 in Germany. We don't know what he did in Germany. We'd love to know. He spends some time with the airborne. So he's basically traveling between Petawawa, Ontario, and Sherbrooke in a car. And he's also occasionally flying out to Edmonton to do basic training and coming back. This establishes his roots. He does a long stint in jail, about 2 or 3 years for the rape, comes out. And the next thing you know, he's working as a roofer in Alberta. And again, an armed robbery in that case. He goes into a fur shop and walks out with a handful of fur coats, serves time. When he comes out in around 91, we have a whole series of murders on the stroll in Calgary between 91 and 93 that a lot of people call this the Calgary prostitute murders. I don't want to get too much into that. I would say that Gregoire was probably responsible for some of those murders, not all of those murders. Again, a copycatting effect. When he's finally apprehended in 1993, 4, it's for the murder of a 7-Eleven convenience store worker named Lonnie Silva. Lonnie, at about 11 o'clock at night, walks out with squeegee in hand to wash the windows, and she's snatched and grabbed. By this point, Gregoire is no longer the sloppy guy. He has perfected what he does, puts her in a car, drives to the outskirts of Calgary, rapes and violently rapes her and murders her in his vehicle, and dumps her, and is almost immediately, when she is reported missing, suspected of the murder, because the law enforcement in Alberta knows that they've screwed up. They know that they've let him out on parole, and they haven't notified anyone. They haven't notified local law enforcement. Parole board is not reported. So when they're tracking Gregoire, in the early the early hours of the morning after De Silva is found, they're doing to cover their own ass. Lonnie De Silva is secondary to it because they know they've screwed up. He's apprehended. He's tried for her murder. He tries, his defense is, well, I had sex with her, but I didn't kill her, which is very interesting. He sees it as not as, he sees it as defensible. He's eventually put away again as a dangerous offender. At some point, he doesn't like being incarcerated in Alberta, so he's transferred to Archambault in Saint-Anne-des-Plaines, north of Montreal. And he dies in prison one night. There's a medical emergency. He's rushed to the infirmary in 2015. Whether it was of his own hand or somebody had it in for him, no, or he died of natural causes, we don't know, but he ends his life in 2015. That's a brief suspect, or a brief summary of Luc Gregoire.
So if you had to, again, going on the solved versus cleared dichotomy, how many murders between Quebec and Alberta are you confident he is responsible for? Because again, we'll stress, and you outline this in the book, it's not that these places were devoid of sexual murders before he or after he arrived there, but they cluster in space and time almost immediately after he arrives in Alberta, as well as in relation to other crimes we know he was committing in Quebec. So, I mean, he's the common denominator in these patterns in both provinces.
The book points to 8, 5 in Quebec and 3 in Alberta. But that's just what the book points to. He's, as I said, so he spent time in Germany. He spent time in Petawawa. We didn't even get in the book to downtown Montreal, which I really wanted to get to, because we know he was in downtown Montreal in the mid 80s. He's arrested for accosting and assaulting a prostitute in a parking lot in downtown Montreal in the mid 80s. There's not only Calgary, there's his whole the time that he lived in Edmonton, Alberta. He spent time in Manitoba. So there's all these other areas, and I would be inclined to add to the other 8 the possibility of, well, in my mind, I could write a whole other book on Gregoire and what's missing from the book with Montreal, and conservatively peg him for 3 Montreal murders.
So we're talking.
I'm sorry, Michael. Was it you that got the letter from him saying that he wasn't responsible, and I hope you find, the murderer of your sister? Didn't he write that to you and kind of dismiss that he was even a suspect in it? Was it
you want to talk about the letter?
Yeah, let's talk about the letter.
Sure. So, before we get to the letter, I can say I can say that the Quebec police showed an uncharacteristic for about a 2-year period amount of interest in Gregoire and cooperation with me. That was I was just going to ride the wave because I knew it wasn't going to last. But there was a guy. There was an investigator who was he had been trained at Quantico. A couple of them had been trained in the early 2000s at Quantico to be in behavioral profiling, and they were kind of hot to to practice what they had learned. And one of them picked on Gregoire and was very diligent in flying to Calgary and reviewing the file. He was very diligent in placing like a mole in Gregoire's cell to see if police mole to see if he could turn. He was very diligent in submitting Gregoire to a lie detector test, which he passed. No surprise. Michael has, I forget the wording you've used on lie detector tests, but it's very good. They can be fooled.
Certainly by psychopaths, yes, because there's no jeopardy or stress response attached to lying. In fact, telling the truth is more likely to elicit a stress response because it's a deviation from their standard operating procedure.
Right. So the letter, I was running out of options, and part of it was predicated on this investigator telling me he will never get let out. And like a fool, I believed it. And prior to his death, he was petitioning for parole and was probably going to get it. And this outraged the Lanny Silva family, as you might expect. They could not believe that then, after like just over 15 years, that this process was going through. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When I believed he wasn't getting out, I was like, well, why don't I try writing him? So I wrote him a very standard letter that was non-confrontational, as I remember it. It was very much like, look, I'm going through this thing. I'm trying to find who killed my sister, and it was very much like, I don't think you did it, but maybe you know someone who did. It was that kind of thing, and I wrote the same letter to 2 other offenders who I knew had nothing to do with it. And I think and that's not in the book, but I don't think. But I think what's most telling about that is their response in contrast to Gregoire's response. One of them completely ignored me, which is the right thing to do. It's like, don't write this guy. One of them wrote a very personal letter, was also handwritten, that was convincing, showed a lot of genuine empathy, and was convincingly confounded as to why I would think he had any knowledge of what happened to Teresa. So the third one was Gregoire, and was filled with a lot of, I mean, if you read it or see it in the book, a lot of playful language, a lot of taunting language. I mean, if you just read it for what it was, what it says is, no, I didn't kill your sister, and no, I have no knowledge of what happened. But the way it's constructed, and we had a couple of handwriting analysis people look at this, is very telling. It kind of wants to draw you in and draw you on, is the best way that I would describe it. It didn't convince me that he didn't have anything to do with it whatsoever.
No, I took it from like, all right, if this was a kid writing an essay in the class, how would I interpret what he's saying? Because I'm good with the lies. I'm good with capturing if someone's lying. But I took the same thing, but in my mind, I felt like, wow, is he controlling? he's still controlling. Even now he's controlling, because even in the letter, the way that he explicated, the way that he wrote it, it was like, I almost felt like he was smiling behind it. I'm still controlling these people. I might be in here, but I don't have to tell you anything. You know what I mean? And I always found that to be something with when once they're in jail, why can't you just say you're in jail for the rest of your life? Why can't you just say it? And why can't you just say what you did? You're already there. You're not getting, but in his mind, he may have thought that there was a good chance he was going to get paroled. He was going to be able to get out on these certain things, but he's still controlling.
Well, he did. That's what I didn't know.
Yeah.
Was he clearly knew he was potentially going to get out, and I didn't know that.
Right. And so that's why you weren't even going to get a real response from him. But you could clearly, as soon as I read it, the first thing I thought was, wow, he's still controlling even now behind bars. But I didn't know that he was petitioning to get out again. So that makes sense as to why he would do what he did.
But even
for various reasons.
Even in saying no, I mean, the tone of that letter, there is such risk in such balls in what he does. I mean, it's pretty classic.
Mind blowing.
He still loves. I mean, he's definitely, from the time he was released in Alberta, I mean, those murders on the stroll in Calgary were high profile. I mean, they were in the, Teresa's murder and the others were not high. This was in the news. He was playing cat and mouse in Alberta, most definitely.
John, do you feel, and I want to know if I would feel this way, but if I wrote a book and I did a podcast and I did, the book is very convincing. It's very convincing. Even if you were doing a trial by media, that would probably be pretty successful if people read the book, if they really got into it, because everybody should read it. But so do you feel a sense of closure without them announcing that he was the killer? Do you feel you've done enough that would make you feel solid in the fact that you may have found your sister's killer? Do you feel that way?
Well, I do. I am a little frustrated.
That it can't be validated.
No, it's not that. I'm a little frustrated of the lack of interest and response in Quebec to this book. However, not quite surprised.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, John. You teased us with that earlier. There's reasons why people in Quebec don't know and don't want to know the name Luc Gregoire. So I feel we're getting to that.
Yeah. So I thought this was a slam dunk, that we would get a French translator, and we got a bunch of COVID this and that. But the bottom line is, no one wants to translate this book into French. And I even, the few people who have written about it, there's some very good journalists from La Presse who have covered it, are also mystified. Like, what is going on here? The name Gregoire is a very common name in Quebec, yes. However, there's some interesting people named Gregoire from that era who, making the genealogy link, we were never able to do it, but nevertheless. So there is a Sûreté de Quebec investigator, a very prominent one, who sort of came to, who was working in parallel at that time, named Luc Gregoire. He didn't work this case or other homicide cases, but shortly after these murders, in the early 80s, he started to work the Sherbrooke area. His brother, Normand Gregoire, was basically, he was the crime scene photographer, the Sûreté de Quebec. In fact, he took the crime scene photos for Teresa's case. So there's these Gregoires. It's sort of like, okay, I can see how that could be a conflict of interest and a compromise. There's a very famous politician named Gilles Gregoire, who in the early 1980s, he rose to prominence in I believe it was the Liberal Party. Anyway, he was a politician, and he got caught kitty diddling in the early 80s. And there's a lot of it's sort of like, well, was he really, sleeping with these 15-year-old girls, or was he set up? There's that. And I don't really know the answer to that. I do know that his career was ruined. He was a big mouthpiece politician. And so he's another Gregoire. And I just wonder if Luc was somehow attached to those families, because it does seem odd. We've said this before, but, it very much appeared that Luc Gregoire's activities in Sherbrooke, by the time he committed what I believe to be his fifth murder, Teresa, the action was getting a little too hot. He was becoming, it was becoming to the point where somebody would have to do something if he was to continue this way. And I think what happened, he was basically given a one-way ticket to Alberta, and someone, you could make the argument, someone said, "Get the hell out of here and don't ever come back."
Wow.
So why not translate it in French? I'm in the US, so you have to explain that to me. Why wouldn't they want to, because of that connection?
Well, Quebec is a fishbowl. Quebec is a fishbowl, and it's Michael and I talked a little bit about this. If everyone's brother, you can't turn around without elbowing somebody. So if you're writing for a newspaper and I'm just painting a story. I'm not saying this is true.
No, just tell me generally.
You're an investigative reporter, chances are your wife's brother or cousin is a police officer, and it's like, hey, you can't be overturning those stones, because you're eventually going to get back to, cousin Jean-Marc. It's going to look bad on him. And that's really what's kind of is very, very problematic in Quebec. Very, very problematic.
So it's incestuous. I mean, that it kind of
yes. Thank you.
It's because that kind of happens pretty much everywhere. So people are protected. People don't want to say things. The wrong people get in jail for whatever reason, because we're protecting someone else. I mean, this goes on all the time. It's not. And again, we're not downing police officers in their work or any, that's not what we're doing. There's a lot of people out there who are doing the right thing. But in this particular case, it just seems pretty evident that some things were overlooked. We can leave it at that.
Speaking of
definitely overlooked.
Speaking of police, just for our American listeners, when John says Sûreté de Québec or SQ, that is actually the state police in Quebec. So, and in the book, you do a great job, John, of sort of delineating the culture of the SQ from the city cops, which is very much, that is across the board, including in the US. The state police and the way municipal police operate are often very different, and they're often sort of cagey with each other in many cases, frequently because state police will investigate misconduct at the municipal level. And as I mentioned before, you've really done a great job, I think, aside from acquainting everybody with Gregoire as among, again, the most important of Suspect Zeros to never be discussed, certainly in Canada. You've done a great job capturing the ethos of the late 70s, early 80s, where, again, I was just a kid in the early to mid 80s, very, very young, but I still remember, like, it had a certain musty shag carpet smell everywhere you went. There was always like those old stubby beer bottles. I just remember it always feeling cold. And at the same time, you've got these sort of nostalgic memories, but I always, and maybe I was just overly perceptive as a child, and it explains why I do this for a living now, but there was always a palpable sense of kind of foreboding and danger. Like when you look back at old newsreels, like all the cars were like battered up and looked like what we would today consider to be like, pedophile cars or abduction vans. There was, if you needed help, like maybe find a phone booth, and everything closed at like 6 o'clock. So streets were like barren and dark, and things we take for granted now in terms of freedom of mobility and being able to, operate with a certain sense of safety. I remember back then it felt kind of like, and when you talk about that parking garage in 81, I can picture it. There'd be no lighting, there'd be no security, no cameras, and guys like Gregoire would just hang out there all day waiting for someone. And I think you also paint a good picture for that reason of the fact that even today, this is what it would have been like to navigate some of these cities as a woman, and constantly having to be hyper vigilant about this. I mean, I remember as a kid feeling this was like some of these cities were scary, but in some ways not a lot has changed.
And coming back to Teresa a little bit, John, I want to address something you said. You said there's about 10% that, we don't know what Teresa's, but if you read the book and you listen to what her friends have to say about her, there's nothing but great things. I mean, and nothing to even suggest that she was involved in anything that would have been illegal or that this would have led to her demise, not at all. And the feeling that I got from the book and the descriptions that her friends were saying about her were just of really a lot of integrity, a lot of, helping her friends and wanting to be there for people and giving advice. And I could really liken myself to her, because I feel like I'm that person in everyone's life. They come to me when they want advice about things. And so I completely could relate to her in that sense. And when your friends describe you, and every one of them has nothing but great things to say, that's a testament really to who she was and who she is. So I want to clear that up a little bit, because I really think that you hit the nail on the head. And if there's any closure to be had and then the police don't want to recognize it, I think you've done it. I think anyone who reads the book will feel that.
Well, tying those two ideas together, yes, that's certainly my experience and my impression. I mean, Teresa was a kid at college who was studying and had great friends, both in Montreal and in the Eastern Townships at Champlain, and they did what kids did.
Yeah.
They studied. On Fridays, did they have a drink and maybe smoke some pot? Yeah, maybe. But they got up on Saturday morning and they did their things, and there was I have to really do mental gymnastics in order to kind of find some kind of weird conspiracy. And to tie to Michael's idea, we focus on the murder, but he's absolutely right, because to your opening, Lennoxville and Champlain is this very beautiful, quaint little town. On the St. Francis River. You think of town and gown anywhere in the United States. It's much like that, very peaceful, very rural. And yet, leading up to all of these murders, there were like dozens and dozens of women getting sexually assaulted in that town and complaining about it and getting nowhere. Police reports not being filed, or the police chief saying women are making a mountain out of a molehill. That's a direct quote. That's not, and just denying it. You get to the year-end statistics, and where there's been 15 rapes, and the police chief gets in front of the town council and says, well, we've had no sexual assaults, but we've had an awful lot of robberies, a lot of property thefts, and there is your summary for 1978. I think for anyone, but particularly for young women, you must have felt like you were being completely gaslit, and maybe this is the feeling women always feel.
That's what the feeling I got from the book too, is the gaslighting from a lot of people. But and then even when Teresa was leaving on the train and saying goodbye to your mom, and how many times she went back to keep hugging her before she left, that was it was telling, very telling, very emotional when you read that part. Just having kids, it's just very emotional.
We could turn this into a multi-part actual episode. John, we're just about out of time, but would you be willing to come back and we can maybe, I'd like to talk maybe more about the other Montreal murders as well and how they might tie into Gregoire, because you mentioned you wanted to get them in the book, and I know exactly how that works, and editorial sort of purging sometimes has to happen, but would you consider maybe a part 2 down the road?
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, that'd be absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I feel like we've talked for an hour, but there's certainly a lot more territory we could cover, and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks again for coming on. So again, the book is Wish You Were Here. The suspect zero is Luc Gregoire, but there is so much in this book. The journey, it's about cold cases, it's about restorative justice, it's about a brother's commitment to his sister's memory, and it's about, quite frankly, the bottom falling out of the system in Canada at so many levels.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, please.
It may not be being published in French, but we have an American release date, and that is
Which is when?
May 2022.
There we go. There we go. So ours will both be out simultaneously, because that's around when my next one comes out. So the side by side at Barnes and Noble. There you go.
Let the battle begin, Michael.
Okay, there we go.
All right. Well, thanks again, John.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this has been amazing. Really, really great. And it was very nice meeting you. And under these circumstances, not the best, but very nice meeting you. Michael.
See you next time, Don. Yeah, you want to do our outro?
Okay. Guys, see you next time on Suspect Zero.
On the next episode of Suspect Zero, the case of David Parker Ray, aka the Toy Box Killer.